everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Deanna and you're watching Orchid. Now as you can see, all my epidendrums are currently in bloom or starting to bloom. I do have one more, it's out in my garden and it's also in bloom, so I thought that this might actually be a good opportunity to have a little bit of a chat with you guys about these orchids and maybe give you a few care and culture tips that I have. There are quite a few different varieties of epidendrums, there's lots of epidendrum species, but the ones I'm going to be talking about are specifically the reed stem epidendrums. So this variety of epidendrum usually has a species background which includes the Epidendrum radicans or secundum, but you might actually hear them referred to as different things, including crucifix epidendrums or ground epidendrums. Actually classified as part of the Cattleya alliance, so they can be crossed with this genus, and that actually makes quite an interesting group of intergenerics. There's the Epicattleyas, and in particular the Epicattleya Rene Marquez is on my wish list, but I never seem to find a mature specimen here, so I'm always on the lookout for one of them. Now, fun fact about the epidendrum, but they used to be referred to as the poor man's orchid, and I think that's because in the past, like, orchid growing used to be a bit of a hobby for the rich and wealthy, but these guys used to be quite affordable and really easy to propagate, so they became more affordable to the poorer orchid grower. Overall, these guys are actually really vigorous, they're forgiving, very tolerant of extreme conditions, and I think they're really easy to grow plants. In fact, in many parts of the world, they can actually be grown in full sun, planted in the ground, in the garden. You can see I grow mine potted, but I've seen pictures of these guys grown potted, mounted, even in flower beds, like outdoors. In fact, one of our local nurseries, Fame Orchids in Brisbane, have at their entrance like just a garden bed full of these epidendrums, and they're just growing fully exposed to the elements and in full sun. Besides, as I've mentioned, being really vigorous and easy to grow, other positives of growing epidendrums is that they come in a huge variety of colours and they're actually really quite easy to bloom, and that actually makes them really interesting and easy orchids, perfect for beginners. Reed stem epidendrums tend to have a typical growth habit of these long self-supporting pseudobulbs or canes and leaves which sort of oppose each other along the length of the cane, and then it ends in a terminal spike, and you can see that they grow quite high. The bloom spikes themselves end in this globe of flowers which forms like this circular sort of head. It's really very attractive, and they're sequential blooms, so it'll form this globe of flowers, but then from the tip it'll start forming more buds. And we'll just have a little close-up of the blooms, but the reason they're called crucifix epidendrums is because of that little cross that the lip tends to form, and you can see that compared to other typical orchid flowers, they're actually kind of upside down. So the lip is facing up and the rest of the flowers are facing down. So they're quite unique. They're really pretty unique blooms. So you can sort of see the general size of these plants, and you might be able to see that they can get really quite big, and this makes them also very top heavy. Considering that they can grow up to a few feet tall, they're not really that great if you're a bit short in space. Now, I grow mine potted, and I guess a big downside of that is that being top heavy, they're quite easy to knock over or blow over on a really windy day, and that has happened several times to me, and I've actually lost bloom spikes in the past because of it. So even with these heavy decorative pots, they can still tip over. On the topic of growth habit, some varieties do have a tendency to produce lots of keikis. You can see this Wayne's fuchsia here has keikis coming from heaps of different spots, and I mean, this is a good and bad thing, I suppose. It's not something that I really like in plants, lots of keikis, but it is really good if you want to share your orchids quite a bit or propagate them, and it does also mean more bloom spikes, because you can see these spikes that I have coming out of this one are actually from the keikis themselves. So in terms of care and culture, I did mention that these guys are extremely vigorous and pretty forgiving of most conditions, but I guess there's a few things to keep in mind if you want really nice growths and healthy blooms. So first we'll talk about media, which I think is a pretty easy topic because I'd say these guys could be grown in almost anything. You can see that I grow mine in my usual mix actually. They've got a layer of leca at the bottom, and it's about a 50% sphagnum mix, and I use a premix of bark, charcoal and perlite plus the sphagnum mixed in. So out here in my backyard I've actually got another epidendrum, and this is actually one of my first orchids, and it spent the last entire year out here, and you can sort of get an idea for how big it is. It's mixed in with all my jasmine, but it's got this old flower spike, and then I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a keiki growing out of that, and it's currently in bloom. So here's a little bit of a better look. This is the keiki, and it's actually blooming from the keiki up here. You can see these beautiful yellow blooms, but being one of my early orchids, it's actually potted in this really crappy old Bunnings mix, which is like from a local hardware store, but it's got an orchid mix. It's really dense, it's like soil, and in the end I actually used this only at the time on this epidendrum, these cymbidiums down here, and also on some of my zygos. That's all it was really good for. It's a really dense, awful mix, but it's been in this for over 2 years now, and mostly out of laziness I haven't changed it, but it actually seems to be doing okay. You can see the pot's filled with lots of algae, and there's lots of ants in there as well, but it's growing this new growth and it actually seems to be doing okay. So really, as far as I'm concerned, you could probably pot these guys in just garden soil and they'd still grow as long as you had good drainage. So the next thing we're going to talk about is temperature, and this is something else that epidendrums are really quite tolerant of. This guy, as I mentioned, has been exposed to the elements for a whole year now. Through winter, it did develop some purpling of the leaves. You can still see the remnants here, and a lot of people put that down to a bit of magnesium deficiency. I'm not so sure I can comment on that because I know that there is magnesium in my mixes, and I do add magnesium supplement every now and again, but it was definitely secondary to cold, and a lot of these healthy leaves up the top have reverted back to a green colour. You can see a little bit of purple still left, but also these guys, as I mentioned, are in direct sun, although it never really gets direct sun after about 11 a.m. and this is even in summer. It's tolerated 40 degrees Celsius plus days with direct morning light, and it kind of hasn't skipped a beat through those periods. Hey Frankie. These guys are just chilling on the back porch. Anyway, these epidendrums as well, they just grow on my back deck year round, and these guys are also exposed to the temperatures out here. However, because they're a bit protected by my porch, they don't really get all the wind or a lot of that direct sun that the other one gets, so they're a little bit more protected, but they do still experience winter temperatures down to about 5 degrees Celsius, and they actually tolerate that quite well. What I wouldn't do is expose them to frost. So if you think you're going to get near freezing temperatures, I wouldn't expose them to that. I would protect them somehow. And even though you can see that these guys were exposed to cold, their leaves aren't as damaged because they were protected from winds and from, I guess, a lot of that moisture that the cold nights bring when they're exposed out in the garden. Watering these guys is really straightforward as well. They love lots of water while they're growing, but having said that, they're pretty drought tolerant as well. So if you go away for a few weeks and don't get around to watering them, they're actually probably going to be fine. However, I don't think you can actually water them too much as long as you have a mix that doesn't stay extremely soggy or waterlogged. I water my outdoor one in the backyard with a hose too, and I just don't think it really minds poor water quality at all, to be honest, and I just have some slow release fertilizer in there and hose it down, and every now and again it'll get like the rest of the Vander bucket when I chuck it out. So in my opinion, they honestly just grow like weeds no matter what I do. I do suggest a lot of fertilizer though, almost similar to Vander level, and mine take fertilizer at almost every feed. So light is one factor that you can't really compromise on with reed stem epidendrums. They need a lot of light to successfully grow and flower. They need, I would say, even higher than general Cattleya light, and a lot of these guys will tolerate direct sun if you accustom them to it. Without this light level, they probably won't flower, and I've read that they develop really rambly growth habits, so they become a lot taller and lankier, and they won't self-support as well. So if you want strong, sturdy growths that don't need a lot of support, give them adequate light and fertilization. I think that's really the key to success with these guys. The very last thing I want to talk to you guys about with these are pests, and most articles will tell you that these guys are generally really pest tolerant, and I think to some degree that's true. These guys have been generally pest free. Unfortunately, and actually quite surprisingly, I've had issues with spider mites on these guys in the past. So most of the articles do apparently say that scales and aphids are the main issues with these epidendrums, but I've found that actually I have had spider mites on my other one in the past, and that's actually one of the reasons it ended up in my backyard. One, because it was just so huge and difficult to manage in my grow space, but secondly because it ended up with spider mites and I ended up putting it out there and treating it there. I have seen spider mites on one of these guys in the past, but I treated it and it was pretty easy to get rid of, unlike some of my other plants like cymbidiums where I've really struggled to get rid of them. But apart from that, I've never seen anything like mealybugs, or I've never seen scale on my epidendrums, so besides the spider mites I haven't personally had any issues. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this video on epidendrums and reed stem epidendrum care. I absolutely love these guys, and even though they take up a bunch of space, I am honestly considering getting more of them. I want some bright red ones, orange ones. I just want the whole rainbow of colors of epidendrums, and I think they are so worth the space. They just flower so reliably, they're so easy and forgiving, and you can neglect them and they'll be fine. You can overwater them and they'll be fine. So if you're a beginner, or if you just want orchids where you can just have this variety of colors and these beautiful blooms, these are the guys for you. So I hope you guys did enjoy this video and you got a few tips and tricks from me. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more orchid videos. Hit the notification bell if you want to be informed when I release a new video, and I hope you guys have a fantastic week and happy growing until I see you next time. Bye!